Hello and welcome. The borders of the economic world are growing. There are more than 30 countries now that form part of the growth net, the constellation of new economies that are setting the economic direction. The question now is, will growth revive and will the tide reverse? Well, who better to answer that question than Claude Smadja, President of Smadja Smadja Advisory, Switzerland. Mr. Smadja, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me with you.
Right. So, reviving growth, reversing the tide. That's the theme
Yes.
that we started upon. Where do we stand? What are the threads that are coming out of all the discussions that you're seeing, not just in here, but also around the world at this point, and where are we headed?
I think, first of all, that we need to reverse the tide, but at the same time, we have to be realistic that this is not a crisis. It is a slowdown. It requires structural adjustment. There are warning signals, but this is manageable, and in fact, this could be turned into an opportunity. This is point number one. Point number two, which I think is important, is that in the discussion here, you could see how many opportunities there are. We were having this morning a fascinating discussion about Africa, and you discover the kind of new companies which are emerging, the kind of potential for growth, the kind of progress which have been made in the last few years in terms of transparency, better governance. So in a way, this is all about opportunities, and this is all about differentiation, not going like there into like a blind man, but being able to differentiate where and how to get into and how to do it the right way.
Okay. And what's changing in general and specifically? Because are we seeing the same, at one time there were 30 countries which were all showing similar characteristics. Are you seeing the same kind of undercurrents today? What's changing underneath?
What is changing, and I think it is a very positive development, is that before you had this kind of knee-jerk reaction. You say emerging market and the investment tap opens. I think what we have today is a kind of more, I would say, mature approach. Emerging market will remain a key factor, a key component of any portfolio of institutional investment and a key component of FDI flows for the years to come, for many, many years. But what you need to do is this country having the right mix of micro and microeconomic policy? Is this sector having the right potential? Do I have a skill? Is this place having the kind of predictability I need in terms of strategic orientation, not day to day?
Right.
So these are the kind of consideration that are now taking a much heavier weight in terms of investment decision. And as I said, it is a good thing. It is a good thing because before it was a kind of, I would say, shooting from the hip approach. Emerging market, there are opportunities, let's go there. No, emerging market, there are opportunities, let us select, let us prioritize, let us differentiate, and let us subject that to greater scrutiny so that we have more sustainable growth.
Right. So, but in terms of the transition from, everyone zeroing in on BRIC, on which I know you have strong views, to understanding that there's something far deeper and wider, do you agree that the transition has been made?
I fully agree that the transition has been made, and people realize today that it is not a matter of an acronym, whatever it is a matter of a trend involving a growing number of countries. When you talk about Ghana growing at 9%, when you talk about countries like Kenya being able to adjust and adapt and integrate the latest mobile phone technologies, when you talk about countries like Mexico doing quite a number of very painful, very strong structural reforms, when you see, for instance, the kind of adjustments that China is doing, so you realize that it is not a matter of 3, 4, 5 countries. It is a matter of a whole group of countries trying to have their spot in the sun, if I can put it like that, in the global economy.
Right. So you've already said that how businesses should be approaching this whole opportunity, and by really drilling down much deeper and trying to understand each market independently. What else, what other advice would you offer businesses or businessmen who are watching this?
I think what we have seen in the first session, where we had really the feedback from the business leaders who were there, we see what worries them most. It is the ability to have the skills that they need. all these countries need to produce more skills. We have seen from the feedback from the participants, they need a kind of more predictable regulatory environment because they hate shocks and they hate bad surprises. What we have seen also from, in a way, the expectation from the business community is the fact that today, if you want to have sustainable growth, you need to involve really many communities. And above all, you need to make sure that the part which represent 50% of the population, the women, are really more and more integrated in economic life, in wealth creation, in job creation, in social development.
Right. And if you were to now spin forward, what are the key challenges, tasks and opportunities that you see?
I think one of the key tasks and opportunity is really creating better communication among young entrepreneurs. I think there is a communication gap, there is a knowledge gap.
And you're saying this is across the world?
And this is across the world, but even more among entrepreneurs from emerging markets. Because these young entrepreneurs from emerging markets, in a first phase, they have been looking toward Europe, toward the United States, to learn, to network, and they have gotten a lot of benefit from that. But I think now we need to get into the operational phase, which is how entrepreneurs from dynamic countries in Asia can connect with young entrepreneurs from dynamic economies or dynamic states in India. How do we make sure that Indian young entrepreneurs and Chinese young entrepreneurs can identify opportunities for synergies? And there are many of them. How can we make sure that young companies in Mexico, which are now, and I speak because we go there every year, we have a big event there, are now discovering, oh my God, there are quite a good things that I could do with partners in India. And in the same way, some Indian companies, I mean, just take one element. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you had maybe 7, 8 Indian companies in Mexico. This year, I was amazed to discover that we have about between 30 and 40 Indian companies. 5 years, 7 years ago, you didn't have, maybe you had 2 Mexican companies in India. Today you have 15 of them operating, about 15 of them. This is a start, but it shows that people are realizing that there are tremendous synergies, and I believe that the people who can exploit most these synergies in terms of moving rapidly, moving very fast, as this category of young entrepreneurs. This is why next year at the GrowthNet, we are creating a special program to bring together a group of young entrepreneurs from different countries. And it will be a group that we will put together, not to have academic discussion, but to think about, hey, what can we do together?
And that's a big difference. What are the challenges? What should people be also watching carefully, and what should they be cautious about?
I think one challenge is how do you mitigate the vulnerability toward external shocks. The painful lesson of the last year was to see how, for instance, when there was sometime loose talk about the end of tapering in the tapering in the US, all of a sudden there was panic
Capital
on the
flows out, yeah.
And I think this is a major necessity today for this young economy, growing economies, to say how can we mitigate that? And you can mitigate, because you can, for instance, become less vulnerable to less negative impact on your export by moving into more domestic consumption. You can mitigate that because there will be volatility in financial flows. So there are resources domestically. How can you mobilize them? How do you get the money under the mattress to come into the system and help generate new growth? How do you diversify? How do you increase this interconnection among the South-South, let's say, dynamics? Because we know that this is where a great potential for growth is there. So you have ways and the need to mitigate vulnerability toward external shocks.
Right. So last question, if the first quarter of this year is already over, but how are you seeing the rest of 2014? Is it a better year than last year economically and in terms of opportunities?
I think it will definitely be a better year, because on the one hand, you have the US, which is, we see now that the recovery is taking hold. It is still fragile, but it is taking hold. Europe will not grow. I mean, you might have statistical growth,
but it's out of recession.
0.5%, which doesn't mean anything. But at least it has stopped declining, which is very important. We need to see what happens in Japan, and I am in a kind of wait and see about the results of Abenomics. And I think, very importantly, we have in a number of countries, in a way, the potential now to rebound a little bit. Take Mexico. Growth in Mexico has been anemic. But it was anemic because the government, in a way, neglected to take a number of measures to sustain economic activities. Maybe because they were too preoccupied by launching a number of reforms, because it was a lack of bandwidth, if you want. But today, I think things will start to change. And in addition to that, you will have a dynamic from the US, in a way, reverberating positively in Mexico. If you take China, people are saying, oh my God, China, now it is single digit, there are issues. Yes, but if China can grow at 6-7% instead of 9 or 10, but in a more balanced way, it will be a blessing.
Basically, domestic consumption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of things that makes me, I would say, relatively more optimistic in 2014, 2015 than 2013.
That's a warm note to end on. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mr.
you very
Smadja.
much. Thank you.